All right, let's move on to step 3, identification. The IDEA requires the schools to identify whether a child has a disability. Schools do not diagnose. Also, if you come in with a doctor's note with a diagnosis, that alone does not entitle your child to an IEP. A doctor's note is not enough. The school has a separate burden, a separate requirement that they must identify a child as having one of the 13 disabilities in the IDEA. So how do they do this? First, they have to have at least one of the 13 disability categories, and the child must need special education. We'll talk about what that is. And the child must need a related service. If the kid does not have all three, so they have a disability that's recognized under the IDEA, but they do not require special education, only a related service, or they require special education, but not a related service. Remember how we figure out how they need this? It's from the assessments, right? They have to identify the special education and related services that the child needs in those evaluations according to the law. If the child does not have all three, then they do not qualify as a child, quote, with the disability, and therefore they don't get an IEP. Typically, children that fall into this category where they don't meet all three, those are the kids that have a 504 statement. It's important to understand that the IDEA and the Rehabilitation Act, which is where the 504 plan comes from, are two different laws that have two different definitions of disability that we're not going to get into here. Okay, first, what are the categories of disability? These are the 13 that are listed under the IDEA: autism, blindness, deafness, emotional disturbance, visual impairment, hearing impairment, intellectual disability, multiple disabilities, orthopedic impairment, other health impairment, oops, typos in there, sorry about that, specific learning disability, which has a definition, a specific definition, and traumatic brain injury. Some states have a more detailed definition, by the way, of specific learning disability. So first, does the child have one of these disabilities? The doctor's note, the diagnosis from the doctor is not enough. The school's evaluations, remember we talked about all those assessments, the school's evaluations must reveal whether the child has one of these disabilities. Generally, most children in special education in the US have a specific learning disability, like dyslexia, for example. And the others have speech and language impairments, other health impairments, intellectual disabilities, vision and hearing impairments over here. Combined, it's only like 7.3%. Remember, we talked about collaboration. What I do in my IEPs is I agree to having my son categorized as visually impaired as his primary diagnosis. Technically, he has, all of them. He has a multiple disability under the IDEA. I allow for vision to be primary. Why do I do that? Because it's what's called a low incidence disability under the law. So the state, the school district gets more money for him than they would for other types of disabilities. I allow them to designate him as other health impairment as secondary. Why? Well, he does have orthopedic impairment as secondary. Why? Yes, he has an orthopedic impairment, but again, the school gets additional funding for certain things for him because of his orthopedic impairment. This is not the, the hill I'm gonna die on, having him properly categorized as having multiple disabilities, which is technically correct. I don't care. I personally don't think it makes a big deal what the disability category is. What's important is whether the needs have been identified and whether the IEP addresses those in its goals, etc. So you all can decide how you want to do it, but for me, I think the best thing to do for us as a family is to allow the school to designate him as visual impairment as primary and orthopedic as secondary. Step two, right? Not step two, but the second part of the test. Okay, the kid has one of the disabilities listed under the IDEA. Do they require special education because of that disability? And this is defined as specially designed instruction at no cost to parents to meet the unique needs of the child, including instruction in the classroom, in the home, in hospitals and institutions, and in other settings, in physical education as well. So second, does the child require special education? What is specially designed instruction in that definition of special education? Well, this is a lot of the meat of what we ask for in the IEP, right? You may adapt the content, methodology, or delivery of the instruction. So they're going to get taught in a way that is different than children who do not have disabilities. And this might mean delivery. Are they delivering this instruction in a quiet room so that they can receive the instruction even though they have this auditory processing impairment? Is the content adapted in a way where it's delivered differently? Is the methodology different? The rest of the kids are getting X type of reading intervention, but your child, because of their reading assessments revealed all the needs that they have, is getting an Orton-Gillingham research-based assessment to help them meet those goals. We want them to meet the state's educational standards to the best possible. So the specially designed instruction can be things like intensive academic remediation, one-to-one instruction. We don't call it tutoring. It's called specially designed instruction one-to-one. Orton-Gillingham, Linda Mood Bell for reading, whatever the school is using as their scientifically based reading instruction. Not just anything out of the can, but what is scientifically based for a child with the needs that are identified in the assessments. It might mean behavior therapy, right? All of these things come under the category of specially designed instruction. What is that? What was revealed in the assessments? What specially designed instruction does your child need? Third, they must also need a related service. Remember, we're just talking about identification category, but this stuff is going to continue to come up. Do they need transportation to get to school, speech and language pathology, audiology services, interpreting services, psychological services, PT, OT, recreation therapy? By the way, this is not my list. This is pulled directly from the federal law and regulations. So this is what the federal government has decided are a related service that should be provided under the IEP for a child if they need it because of their disability. Orientation and mobility services, social work, school nurse services, counseling, medical services for diagnosis and evaluation purposes only. What does that mean? Well, if the school says we need a diagnosis before we identify your child as having a disability, or we need a specific kind of doctor to evaluate your child, so that we can come up with identifying the disability category or what your child needs, they have to pay for it. This goes back to that discussion we had about neuropsychologists. These children are really complicated. So in order to provide the medical services for diagnostic and evaluation purposes, they would have to pay for that service. It says so right there in the law. And any such developmental, corrective, and support services that may be required to assist the child to benefit from special ed. What does corrective services mean? Well, if historically the school has not been providing your child with the appropriate reading intervention, for example, then corrective services make up, right? You now need a year of intensive reading instruction to make up for the lack of services, reading intervention that was provided to your child. then they have to provide that under this related service category. Very easy. You have to meet all three in order to properly identify the child. Let's move on to step 4. So now you have all the assessments, you've read them, you have determined whether they're valid and reliable, whether the right person evaluated your child. You've asked for your independent educational evaluations in the areas that your child's assessments performed by the schools were insufficient or inappropriate. The child's has been determined to fall under, the disability has been determined to fall under one of those 13 disability categories because special education and related services because of the disability are required. Now you develop the IEP. Look at everything we did before this, a lot, right? But now you've done everything that you needed to do before you walk into that IEP meeting. You drafted your letter of parental concerns before that evaluations, remember? Get into the habit of doing this before every IEP meeting. Why? Because every concern must be addressed in that IEP. Tell them to attach it to the IEP, not, refer to it in notes. They should actually physically attach it to the IEP. I always say, again, to make it just your top concerns and make them short, this also makes it easier for the school team to put it into the IEP. So step 4, develop the IEP. The IEP team meets to discuss all assessments, right present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, draft goals, determine related services and accommodations to help meet those goals. This looks like a typical IEP meeting, right? I'm kidding. I think this is some big international conference. I don't know. But don't be intimidated, parents, by the number of people that are in that room. The more assessments your child has had in these different functional areas, you need the assessor there to discuss your child's strengths and weaknesses, what those evaluations revealed, what special education and related services your child needs. I would be concerned if there are few, just a couple of people in that room. If I walk into one of my son's IEPs and I don't see a big room full of people around, then I get concerned because that means a lot of people are not present for that IEP meeting who are supposed to be. Who must attend the IEP meeting? The parents, that's obvious. The child, where appropriate. Some of you may have children who are old enough to start participating in their own IEP meetings. The regular education teacher, the special education teacher, someone who can interpret the instructional implications of the evaluation results. That's typically the school psychologist. It might be an education specialist. At the parent's choice or the district's choice, again, this is verbatim out of the federal IDEA. At the parent's choice or at the district's choice, someone with knowledge or special expertise regarding the child, including related service personnel. That might be someone from the Epilepsy Foundation if your child is still having seizures, and that someone there might be appropriate. It might be someone from the Brain Recovery Project there to talk about the various functional implications of these epilepsy surgeries. It could be the one-on-one aide that you've had at home or a caretaker that you've had for your child who knows your kid as well as you do and goes there for, can go in and also talk about what the child's needs are. And it's your choice. The district doesn't have a right to say no. If you tell them that they have knowledge or special expertise about your child, then they're allowed to come. And then, very important, a representative from the district who is qualified to provide or supervise the provision of specially designed instruction, is knowledgeable about the general education curriculum, and is knowledgeable about the availability of resources of the district. What does that mean? That means that the person has knowledge about whether that service can be paid for, whether the related service or the specially designed instruction can be committed by the district. It's not okay for them to say, we're not sure, we have to call home office, I don't have the authority to say yes to that. Then that's not somebody who's knowledgeable about the resources of the district. Let's think about being collaborative. It's entirely possible that your school's principal doesn't have the time to attend your child's IEP meeting or had to be pulled away. I think it's fine if you say, look, if they're not physically present, who here has the authority to call the home office? But that person has to be available by phone during that meeting to say yes or no to whatever it is that the team decides that the child needs. No, we're going to look it up later, or we're going to call you back later, or we're going to call you next week. That is not okay. That is not what the IDEA says. So when you walk into that room that's full of a bunch of people and you feel intimidated, the first thing you should ask is say, can you tell me who is here from the district with knowledge about the availability of resources of the district? Typically, it's the principal or the district rep. If they say nobody is here, we're going to call home office. You ask for assurance that that person is going to be available on the phone that day to commit district resources. You're all sitting in the room. Now you're going to write the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. A quick note, I think it's okay to get a draft IEP ahead of time. I don't think it's a problem, especially for those of us that have children that are really neurologically complicated and have these really long IEPs. Go ahead, ask for that draft IEP ahead of time. Take a look at what those present levels are, because the assessments are the most important part of the IEP. But why is that? It's because the assessments are used to identify the child's needs, which are all laid out in the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. Needs identify goals. Goals identify what special education the child needs to meet the goals. The assessments identify the supplementary aids and services that the child needs to meet the goals, the related services. Then the team decides on the progress reports and whether the goal is met or not met. So right now we're at the present levels and we're going to figure out what the child's needs are based on those assessments, and we're going to lay them out in the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. We'll call it the PLAF. What's supposed to be in there? This is what your child can do today, right now, presently. That's why it's called present levels. It has to be updated every year. All children change from year to year. Cutting and pasting last year's present level statement is a FAPE violation. You have to go through prior IEPs and take a look. If they are repeating present levels year after year, cutting and pasting, beware of cutting and pasting from another child's IEP. This is a reflection of just how tremendously overworked your teacher might be. Those PLAF statements have to be present level. It has to include how the child's disability affects involvement and progress in the general education curriculum. It has to include strengths and weaknesses. This superhero PLAF man, we'll call him, holds up the rest of the IEP. The PLAF defines the goals, services, accommodations, and ultimately the placement of the child. What makes that PLAF strong? The assessments. The assessments are what makes them strong. So this is why we're always saying that the assessments are the most important part of the IEP. So let's take a look quickly at this couple of sentences from this PLAF statement. Henry is a happy and joyful child. He greets teachers and staff every day. He loves to play with his classmates. He enjoys playing catch with them, running and kicking the ball during recess. So this is my son. Yes, he's generally happy and joyful. He greets teachers and staff every day. So someone someone who has never met him would think that he's walking into a classroom, saying hello to his teachers, talking to the staff. My son is totally nonverbal. He generally does not acknowledge strangers and often does not acknowledge people he knows. Henry loves to play with his classmates. Most children are ghosts to my son, so I really don't understand what this PLAF statement means. And this is actually real sentences pulled from one of my son's older PLAF statements. He doesn't play with other kids. I don't know why that's in there. I think they're trying to say that, he's in the room with them, next to them, but no, that would be inaccurate. He enjoys playing catch with them, running and kicking the ball during recess. My son cannot run. My son cannot kick. My son may play catch with you, but you really have to motor him through a lot of that process. Why do we care that this PLAF statement is wrong? What's the big deal? We want that PLAF statement to paint a picture of the child for someone who has never met the child before. Remember I said that you were going to go to due process and you should assume this during this whole process of building the child's IEP? That due process hearing officer has to be able to read that PLAF statement as well and get a clear picture of your child and their strengths and their weaknesses. This statement does not provide a clear statement of my son, so it is insufficient. It is wrong. The PLAF has to list academic achievement, so reading, language arts, math, writing, science, history. Where do we get all these statistics from, or all these needs or strengths, weaknesses in academic achievement? From those evaluations that we talked about. It should list the elements of reading. So remember we talked about the big five: phonemic awareness, phonological, which is a part of phonological awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary. We've already talked about this. Comprehension. You want it to list expressive, receptive reading and writing vocabulary, and either the Lexile level or some other benchmarking system, Fountains and Pinnell, one of those other benchmarking systems we talked about earlier. What level are they with their reading? Why do we care? Because we're going to tie their progress monitoring towards this benchmarking, towards this reading level. So it would say, where your child is in terms of this reading level. That would be in the PLAF statement. Math, numeracy, math computation, problem solving, fluency, all of this should be laid out in the PLAF. Just make a chart, PLAF, start with academics on the left in a big Sharpie pen. Reading, math, break all of this stuff down. Functional performance. The PLAF is not just your child's academics, where they are, but also where they are functionally. Their cognition, communication, speech, hearing, vision, functional vision, orientation and mobility, gross and fine motor, social, emotional behavior, self-help, activities of daily living. And then when we start talking about transitioning from preschool to kindergarten, or from middle school to high school, or into post-secondary, what their transition needs are. What are the 6 signs of a bad PLAF statement? Take a look at your IEP, because I'm sure many of you have PLAF statements that are not good. The PLAF statement remains the same year after year. The PLAF statement lists test scores that are not self-explanatory. It uses highly technical language like confidence interval, at risk, atypical, T-score, clinically significant. This is stuff you have to look up, right? You have to Google it, or you have to go to a manual. If you need to do that during the PLAF statement, it's not good. It's a bad PLAF statement. You have to be able to have somebody read it who does not know your child and who has a clear picture of what they're like from reading it. Uses imprecise language. The child is borderline intellectual functioning, low average. What exactly does that mean? That doesn't provide us with anything. It has to be more detailed than that. Uses terms and references that cannot be interpreted without the use of test manuals. If I have to go back and read the test manual for the Woodcock-Johnson in order to understand my child's scores on the Woodcock-Johnson that are listed in the PLAF, that is not good enough. It has to be clearly explained so that you don't have to go through a testing manual to understand it. It uses vague terms or phrases like student has a sense of humor, kind of like my son's PLAF statement, right? He likes to help his teacher. He enjoys his peers. That's really vague and really difficult to ascertain from child to child. What is a sense of humor for one child who speaks and is at one cognitive level may simply mean that the child giggles for a child at another cognitive level. So very unclear. These are the top 6 things to show you that your PLAF statement just is not good enough. So very quickly now we've gone through the PLAF. Now you've got that level of detail in there. You've identified the needs in that PLAF. Now you're going to start writing goals. Again, it's okay to get the IEP ahead of time so that you can see the goals that the teachers have prepared. Remember, you're a very important part of this IEP process, and it is perfectly fine for you to recommend your own goals, recommend some rewritten goals based on what the draft IEP says. It is okay. So many times I had parents saying, well, the school's goals were this and I didn't understand them and I just said yes to them. No, you're part of that IEP team, remember? And you speak up and you say, I don't understand this, or I like this goal better. How do we know what goals we're going to have? Because we're here at this step. Every need has a goal to it. You identify the need, and now you're going to identify or craft a goal to help the child resolve that need. The needs come from those assessments. Don't be afraid of all the things you can't do your child can't do that are revealed in those assessments. I know that this can be painful for so many parents, and they may come back and say, oh my gosh, my child's scores were so low here. I just can't believe how many needs he has. Hey, your child is who he is. If those are the needs that are revealed, then let's start crafting some goals to help your kid overcome those. At the same time, every single need does not have to be a goal. Some of us have children with multiple significant needs. And again, it would be impossible to have every single need identified addressed by a goal. I certainly couldn't do it for my son. So for many of those things, I may say, for the year, so what? I may not focus on getting him to use his affected hand, he's got hemiparesis, as a helper hand. For this year, for us, we're focusing primarily on functional communication. So those are really at the top of my list for his goals. And everything else is moved to the bottom of the list, or it's not even on the list at all. Focus on those important needs. Those of you who have children who really can learn how to read, I say move those to the top of the list, because being functionally illiterate is really going to create some tremendous headaches in adulthood. So what are your child's top 3 needs? Think about those. Goals have to be measurable. They have to be reachable within 1 year. So this is what the team decides on together, that they are reachable within 1 year. They have to meet challenging objectives. I didn't want to talk about case law too much, but this was a unanimous Supreme Court decision that came out 2 years ago, where the Supreme Court said, look, these goals have to be challenging. You can't have these easy goals that your child has already met or is already close to meeting. They have to be challenging objectives that can be reached in 1 year. These are academic goals as well as functional goals. So we can look at toileting goals or feeding goals just as much as we can look at goals to improve reading vocabulary, expressive vocabulary, phonological awareness, all those things. And they have to, whoops, sorry about that. They have to enable the child to make progress in the general education curriculum and are based on state academic standards for that grade. based on state academic standards for that grade. So take a look at your state's academic standards, whether they're Common Core, whether it's something else. They have to be based, when there are these academics, on these state academic standards for the grade. So let's look at an example. Now, listen, goals, just like you can have thousands of different assessments, you can have thousands of different goals. I think it probably would be a good idea to do a separate goal seminar. There are tons of goal banks online, and we're going to hopefully soon, we're having a very busy year, but try to upload some draft goals on our website for these different areas of need that we see based on different epilepsy surgeries. But let's just get into the practice of creating these goals. So this is a fluency goal. Remember, fluency is both accuracy of reading as well as prosody. So by X date, John will read a grade level passage with minimal assistance in 4 out of 5 trials with 80% accuracy. Typical goal you might see. But what's wrong with it? Well, what grade level? The grade level that John is in, so 5th grade, let's say, or the grade level at which he's currently reading. Maybe he's at a 3rd grade level and needs to get up to a 4th grade level. So what grade level are we talking about? What is minimal assistance? Does that mean the teacher reads the passage to him first? Does that mean the teacher turns the page? I don't know what minimal assistance means. In 4 out of 5 trials, when are those trials given? Are they given once every 2 or 3 months so that I don't know when he's met that fluency goal or what progress he's making until the very end of the year? And with 80% accuracy. So 4 out of 5 trials with 80% accuracy, is that in the 4 trials have to be 80% accurate, but the 5th trial can be 0% accurate? Or does that mean that in 4 of those trials, the average has to be 80% accuracy? I don't know. This is really confusing to me. The other thing is 80% accuracy is way below frustration level for fluency. All of these assessments and benchmarking systems that look at fluency define these different levels as follows. If you're reading independently, you're at 95% word accuracy. If you're reading at instructional level, which means you still need to be instructed on how to read, but you can manage reading, you're at 90% word accuracy. If you're reading at frustration level, so the Lexile level or whatever grade level passage we're having you read is difficult for the child to read, then it's less than 90% accuracy. 80% is below frustration level. So going back to this goal, if the goal is to have the child read with 80% accuracy overall, that's not success. That's a child who still cannot read well, and that's not what we want from school. You want a child to be at an independent or mastery level of reading for each year. So we're going to rewrite that goal again. By X date, John will read out loud. That other goal didn't say whether it was loud or to himself. Out loud, an unmodified passage, it hasn't been simplified, at Lexile level 690, or whatever benchmarking level you all decided on. Remember I said just ask your school what they use, whether it's Lexile or Fountains Pinnell or whatever. Get the right Lexile level that they can read independently with 95% accuracy in 5 out of 5 consecutive trials given over a 6-week period. Why do I want this over a 6-week period? Listen, You're going to know really quickly if the intervention is working if by 3 months you're seeing little or no progress in reading fluency here. That they're not, they keep doing these trials once a week. So that gives you 5 out of 5 consecutive trials. That's a trial a week with 1 week off. You get this report back at the 6-week period. After three months or so, you're seeing no progress in reading. That 690 is static. Well, then you have an issue. You probably have to increase the level of intervention. You want to see whether the intervention is working or not. My only comment here is if you have a child that has an intellectual disability, meaning an IQ of 70 or less, or you have a child that just had epilepsy surgery and is still on medication, you may not see success as quickly or mastery as quickly on these levels for a few years. So progress may be slow if the child is still on epilepsy medication, and there's research to show this, or if the child has an intellectual disability. The progress here may be slow. In that case, you can give it a little time. You can expect the progress to be made a little more slowly. It depends. Again, it depends on the child. So generally that would be the rule, but again, look at it on a case-by-case basis depending on what the assessments say. Honestly, for reading, the assessments really should, the progress monitoring should be done every 6 weeks. Goals drive services. The more goals you have in a functional area, the more services and service time you have. What does that mean? I had a parent come to me recently and say, they've reduced my child's physical therapy time. He's down to 30 minutes. I looked, there was only one physical therapy goal, one gross motor goal on the IEP, and it was really easy. Well, of course you got PT time reduced. Your kid only has one physical therapy goal and is generally very easy to meet that. So there's no need for your child to have more PT time. If the functional area is important to you, so let's say this is the year that you're working on access to the curriculum physically at school, right? Their orientation and mobility, their functional progress and making transfers in and out of a wheelchair, something like that, then you need to have a lot of gross motor goals because that's going to give you more physical therapy time. If you only have a couple of goals or little to no goals in the functional area, then don't ask for the services to meet that goal because there are hardly any. You're not going to get it. Okay, you have your goals. Now you need the special education to help the child meet the goals. We're here in this column. This is a really easy spreadsheet, by the way, that you can make up. We'll upload one to our website as well. All your needs are identified here. Now you write out the goals that the team decided on to meet each need. Now you write out the special education that is going to be provided for the child to help meet those goals. Going back to what we discussed before, what is special education? Specially designed instruction at no cost to parents to meet the unique needs of the child, including instruction in the classroom, at home, in hospitals, and in other settings, as well as instruction in physical education. What is physical education? Quickly, the development of physical and motor fitness, fundamental motor skills and patterns, skills in aquatics, dance, individual and group games, intramural and lifetime sports. And it can include special physical education, adapted physical education, movement education, and hey, look at that, motor development. So the child's physical education can include all this special education to meet the goals that you've identified that they need. Do they have goals around motor development? Do they have goals around movement? Do they have goals around physical and motor fitness? Do they have goals around fundamental motor skills? If they do, then they're entitled to this type of physical education as specially designed instruction. Looking to the specific definition of specially designed instruction, remember we already went through this, but It's modified classwork sometimes. It's adapting the content, methodology, or delivery of instruction. It may mean a specific methodology like Linda Mood-Bell, which is technically an Orton-Gillingham type of research-based instruction. It might be delivering that instruction in a quiet room. So you may have adapted content that's delivered, like adapted reading content that's delivered using Orton-Gillingham approach like Linda Mood-Bell and delivered in a quiet room. That would be the specially designed instruction. Very different from when the children are getting in general education. And this is a slide we went over already, but it repeats again here when you're looking at what the specially designed instruction is. An example would be one-to-one literacy instruction, explicit, systematic. Sorry, let me back up here. Let's say you have a child with an intellectual disability that's not learning how to read. So now we want them to have specially designed instruction. What does that mean? So that specially designed instruction column to meet those literacy goals that we've set out would say one-to-one literacy instruction, explicit, systematic, and research-based for children with intellectual disability, delivered in a quiet room. That's the specially designed instruction to meet that goal. Supplementary aids and services to help the child meet the goal. So now we're in this column. You've identified the need, you have your goals laid out, you've identified what the specially designed instruction is to help the child meet the goal. What supplementary aids and services does the child get to help meet that goal? These are things that are provided in regular education. It might be a one-to-one aid. Your child might need a one-to-one aid in order for them to be educated in gen ed, then that's fine. That would be the supplementary aid and service that they get. The service would be the one-to-one aid to help the child stay in gen ed. It's whatever the kid needs to be educated with their non-disabled peers, Going back to the spreadsheet, now you've identified the goals, the services that the child needs. What are the related services to help the child meet the goals? We're in this column. Related services, again, we already talked about this, but transportation, speech language pathology, audiology, interpreting services, psych services, PT, OT, rec, therapy, therapeutic recreation, O&M, social work, school nurse, counseling, corrective services like tutoring. Don't call it tutoring though, you call it a corrective service or intensive intervention. Again, this is not my words, this is the IDEA and what it says. What accommodations does your child need to help them meet the goal and access their educational environment? A note about accommodations. Accommodations do not lower expectations. So this may be things like timing and scheduling, extended time for written or verbal response, classwork assignments, tests, multiple breaks throughout a student's work period, preferential scheduling. It might be a setting that reduces distractions like a quiet room, special equipment that may be necessary in a classroom or that may only be provided in a particular school. Is the text going to be presented in large print? Does the child need braille? Books on tape? Do they need visual cues? Do they need a human reader? Is part of that one-to-one aids work to read back to the child? That's certainly something that could be required. Again, did the assessments say that they needed that? Do they need help with response, like a scribe, a graphic organizer, calculator, an electronic note taker, speech to text equipment? These are typical, just some accommodations. There's so many, we can't list them all. Beware of modifications. Modifications do lower expectations. They increase the gap between achievement of students with disabilities and expectations of proficiency. Course materials are modified to a lower level year after year, and then soon the gap widens between the modified work and the on-grade level work. I get it. Some kids need a modified curriculum. My son does. He has a pretty severe and profound intellectual impairment. Those of you whose children don't, those of you whose children have IQ in the normal range or even in the high 60s, low 70s, I'm not sure it necessarily means in all cases that their curriculum has to be modified, especially with reading. For some, they may not need a modification. They just may need more time to learn how to read. Be careful of this. Be careful of getting all A's, getting honors. If you're aware that this is a modification, that's fine, but pay attention to what getting all A's means. If it's on a super modified curriculum, honestly, it's meaningless, and you want to know what is it that your child is getting and what are they being taught. Is your child on a regular diploma track or on a certificate of completion track? You really cannot get a regular diploma if your curriculum has been modified. So you want to look at the different types of diplomas that are available in your school district, and this can differ from district to district or from state to state, and find out what diploma track your child is on. Many of you may have children who are capable of graduating with a regular diploma. Some of us, a certificate of completion is fine. Even if the child just has a mild intellectual impairment, that certificate of completion can be fine as long as you know about it. Don't get surprised, when they're 17 and then you figure out that they didn't earn a regular diploma, that they've been on a modified track this entire time. All right, progress monitoring. Now that you've developed the goals and you have the special education to help meet the goals, and you've identified the services and related services, et cetera, that the child needs, now you're going to monitor progress. You're going to do it at least as often as the schools give their gen ed kids their report cards, which would be probably about 3 times a year, but you can certainly agree to more. And that has to be laid out in the IEP. When does your child get their progress report, and what does the progress report have to address? The IEP must describe how the child's progress towards meeting annual goals will be measured, when periodic reports on the progress will be provided. So for reading, I think it's fine to say every 6 weeks, because you really want to know whether that progress is sufficient. You want the progress reports to include data. You don't want the school to come back and say, the kid is doing fine, he's doing great, happy face. That doesn't tell you anything. You need data to support the progress that your child is making. And teachers know this, and they are trained in multiple means of data collection, especially if they're a special education instructor. This should not be a surprise. This is what they learned in college, is how to collect data for various different types of progress monitoring, depending on the goal. It's not a bad thing to ask for it. Your teacher knows how to do this. That's what they were trained for. There is a great website, National Center on Intensive Intervention, and it has this comprehensive list of academic progress monitoring tools. Spend some time on this website, because especially, obviously with academics, as you're tracking each goal and each part of the Big Five, for example, with reading, you want to make sure that the academic progress is measured using the appropriate monitoring tool. And this website will tell you not only which monitoring tool is appropriate for that functional area, but whether there is evidence to support that it's accurate. All right, to sign or not to sign the IEP. This is a little confusing, and we're not going to get to it too deep, other than to say the federal law says that you must consent to the initial provision of special education. That means the very first IEP. So you must consent to both the special education and the related services in that first IEP. That means by signing it, before your child is accepted into special education. But subsequent IEPs, so after that first IEP, The federal law does not say anything about whether or not you have to sign it. Look at your state regulations. Some of the worst advice I see in some of these social media groups is when other parents say, don't sign that IEP, get a lawyer, yada, yada, yada. Not the case in all states. Some states have, you have stay put. Stay put can be where the prior IEP is in place until you file for due process. It's different state by state. Some states, if you don't sign within 10 days, that new IEP is valid unless you file for due process, and that's when stay put comes into effect. So the worst advice you can get is don't sign that IEP. Look at your state regulations and what it says about those subsequent IEPs, any IEP after the first. The IEP also has to list frequency, duration, and location of supports. That was easy there. Then that behavior intervention plan, that's also something that you can have on your IEP. And we talked a little bit about how you do that. You do that after your functional behavior assessments. What are the components of a good behavior plan? A Day in Our Shoes is honestly one of the best resources online for anything IEP. Lisa Leitner is the founder of that website. She is a self-taught advocate. She's also an epilepsy surgery mom. Go to that website. She's got great information on the components of a good behavior plan. This is from that website. So who's going to collect the data, how frequently, what measurement will be used, what tracking tool will be used, have the data collectors been properly trained, do all the data collectors have the same understanding of what the target replacement behaviors look like? That's what's going to be in your behavior intervention plan. You're going to look at how good behavior will be reinforced. What is the quality of the reward? Is it meaningful to the child? What is the quantity of the reward? How little can be delivered in order to gain the desired effect? Immediacy, satiation, how is the reward eventually faded out? These are all things that have to be addressed in a good behavior intervention plan. Who's responsible for every aspect of the behavior intervention plan? Who will enforce the limits? Do they all have the same expectations of what behavior is being targeted? Are they consistently enforcing limits? All this, again, listed in that great website. For those of you that have a child with behavioral issues, make sure all of this is in their behavior intervention plan. Okay, we're almost done. Step 5 is placement. Step 5 is placement. After you've gone through all this, now you can decide on where your child is placed. Placement is a team decision. And honestly, technically, it's not an IEP team decision. So there's actually a smaller team that can decide the placement with the parent. It's a service and not a prepackaged class. And the law favors that the child is educated in the least restrictive environment with a continuum of services presented. What is this continuum of services? The least restrictive environment is general education. Then you move down to gen ed with consult or gen ed with part-time assistance. That might be a resource room, for example, gen ed with a resource room. Part day in a special ed class, the rest of the day in gen ed, full day in special ed classes. A special education school. Some of you may think of this as a private school. Technically, it's called a non-public school. And then the most restricted would be homebound, or like what's it called? It's off the tip of my tongue. When you live there, when you actually send the child away to live at the school. The school is highly incentivized to move your child to gen ed as much as possible. But we know that this doesn't happen. Typically, kids in our community might be pulled into a special day class here. Residential schools, that's what I was looking at. And that's the most restrictive placement. The law favors general education. So you always want to talk about that. Is the law favors your child being educated in a general education placement and not in a special education class. One thing I will say though about special education schools, my son was in a special education private school. It was the best thing for him to learn how to use a communication device. Those of you who have children who are struggling to learn how to read, the public school may not be equipped to educate your child appropriately. And there may be a non-public school in your area that specializes in teaching children with brain injury, or that specializes in teaching children with significant learning disabilities, and that might be the better placement. So explore those programs, because I think, especially when you're trying to teach a child how to read, or focusing on academics, that for many of you, a private program may be the better option than the public school program. When is a child not supposed to be in gen ed? There's a test, and a child stays in gen ed on an IEP by the school sort of weighing all these different factors. What are the educational benefits available in the regular classroom? What are the non-academic benefits of the interaction between the student with disabilities and those without disabilities? And that's the benefit to your child. What is the impact of the student with disabilities on the teacher and other children in the classroom? And what is the cost of supplementary aids and services required for mainstreaming the child? Remember that supplementary aids and services has a very specific definition. Supplementary aids and services is not special education, and supplementary aids and services is not related services. It has its own definition, which basically means, what do we need for that child to stay in the gen ed classroom? For many of us, that might mean a one-to-one aide, or maybe a nurse or something like that. That's all the costs that they're allowed to take into consideration for a gen ed placement. So if they say, well, the child needs so much physical therapy, they can't be in gen ed, that factor doesn't come into play, because physical therapy is a what? It's a related service. If they say the kid can't be in gen ed because they need an Orton-Gillingham research-based intervention to teach them how to read, so we have to put them in a special day class, that's not right, because Orton-Gillingham is what? It's a specially designed academic and specially designed instruction, right? It's special education. This does not say special education, so we would not use that as a factor. The impact of the student with disabilities on the teacher. My son is really loud and he has some significant behavioral issues. You cannot tell him to quiet down. He just won't. He screams and hollers really significantly. That would be unfair to the other children in the class to have them. It would have a tremendous impact on the other students in the classroom. So he would fail this gen ed mainstream test. It would not be the appropriate placement for him. All right, you're done with that IEP. You go through it, you progress monitor, you see if the child meets the goals, all that good stuff. Now you review the IEP at least every year. Are the goals being achieved? Should we increase the services? Listen, if a goal has not been met, or if a goal is really looking like there's no way it's going to be met by the end of the year, you call an IEP meeting and you take a look at the data, and you do what? Modify the goal or increase the service. You increase the service, because the team decided that that goal could be met within a year. It's not being met, so services need to go up. The IEP has to be reviewed at least annually. The parent has the right to bring in their own data, and then you revise that IEP as necessary. Step 7, reevaluate. When do you reevaluate a child? We're not going to go over evaluations again. We already did that. But when do you do that? When do you ask for another evaluation? Has there been a change in the child's medical status? My son has had a terrible time with hydrocephalus. So when we're kind of coming out of the woods from a new shunt surgery, we will ask for reevaluation because he has changed. Are you seeing changes in behaviors? That's time for reevaluation. It doesn't have to be every 3 years. The law says it should be at least every 3 years and no more than once a year, but you can ask for it to be, every 1.5 years or annually because of this change in medical status. Sometimes the school will object to reevaluating. So they may say, well, let's have a read hearing or a review of existing evaluation data. Don't be afraid of a read. All you do is have a meeting with the team and other qualified personnel to review the existing evaluation data, review evaluations and any information provided by the parent, review the current classroom-based local or state assessments, review any observations by the teachers, and identify if additional data is needed to determine if, does the kid still have a disability? What are the educational needs of the child? What are their present levels of and related developmental needs? Does the child need special education? Whether any additions or modifications to the special education and related services are needed to enable the child to meet goals. And the district must give any assessments and other evaluations that are necessary for the team to get the data that they need. So if they're refusing an evaluation, for example, you just say, well, fine, let's have a read meeting so that we can get some assessments from you to see if we need additional evaluations. So this is almost the end here. I like to say to keep it simple, stupid. If you have a long list of complaints, if you are a mama bear, you are not going to be heard. We want you to focus on the top few things that your child needs every year in a collaborative way. This is how you're going to get good results for your child. Pick the 3 things that your child needs. That would be my recommendation. Really quickly, we will do a completely different seminar on individual transition plans, but these are focused on what the purpose of the IDEA is, which is further education, employment, and independent living. And when do we do these transition plans? We start thinking about adulthood. You can start thinking about transition when the child is young as 8. What is realistic for your child when they get older? Is your child going to be on a modified or regular diploma? My son's on a certificate of completion. Yours might be on a regular diploma. Are you going to need to extend the runway until the child is 22 or more? Again, something that you're going to have to start thinking about as early as the child is 8 years old. By the child's 16th birthday, and this is earlier in some states have by the child's 14th birthday IEP, you have to have a transition plan. These are really typically quite poorly addressed by school districts. The school has to look at their education, their future education, how they are socially and emotionally, employment, adult living. We think about this all the time. What happens after we die? What's my son's adult living situation going to be? And you invite all these outside participants in, like the Department of Rehab, vocab training, all of these things, education, social, emotional, employment, adult living situation. These are all teased out with intensive assessments similar to what we talked about earlier in this IEP training. Going to do a whole different seminar on this, but again, there are tons and tons of different assessments that start to figure out how your child is going to transition into adulthood. Armed forces, be very careful. I've had parents come to me and say, oh, my son wants to join the Army. Okay, great, that's his transition plan. We're going to get him to the Army. The armed forces have some requirements in terms of what your abilities have to be in order to become a pilot, for example, or an infantryman. your child may not be able to go into the armed forces. So don't let that transition plan be so simple. Oh, my kid's going to go into the Army. You need to take a look at what those requirements are, and you need to tease all these things out in a comprehensive assessments for that. Thank you very much. This is the end of our training session. If you have any questions, email us at info@brainrecoveryproject.org.